2 weeks ago, I introduced a new sermon series for the year, and if you heard it, you know that I took a big bite. And this morning, I have to start chewing. We're going to be exploring what I'm calling the undomesticated Bible, looking at those wild passages we don't like to think about, those passages that lurk like monsters under the bed while we try to convince ourselves that the Bible is nice. When I introduced the series, I listed examples of the kind of wild, undomesticated, not nice passages that I had in mind. But I left a big one out, not on purpose. I did list the command God gives Abraham to sacrifice his own son Isaac. And I did list God's apparent command to the Israelites to basically commit genocide against the Canaanites, and many other things. But I left out the flood, which is a significantly horrific story. It's, as Dr. Seuss would say, on beyond genocide. It's planetocide. God essentially drowns everybody in the world except 8 people, which some folks find, disturbing. So that's where we're going to start our tour of horrifying biblical passages. The scale of the destruction alone gives the flood a place of prominence on any list of biblical terror. But it is also, full disclosure, just being honest here, and cowardly, this is also a bit of a soft start, because there are all sorts of reasons that the flood story is not as disturbing as it first appears. And not all of the passages we'll be looking at this year have that nice emergency exit feature. Another reason that this is a bit of a soft start is that I've already given a sermon on the flood about 1.5 years ago. But back then, we didn't really approach the story from the perspective of the horror that you can experience. Instead, we focused on hearing the flood story in its original context, something which we will talk about again this morning. There will be some overlap with that past sermon, which makes me a bit uneasy. On the other hand, a good number of you weren't here back then. And even if you were, it was 1.5 years ago. And it's probably not right at the top of your mind right now. But before we explore that horror, I just want to say that Heidi and I have generally found that children are not nearly as upset by the flood story as grown-ups are. In our experience, children, and this is of course in general, there are exceptions always anytime you say anything about human beings, but children in general are instinctively drawn to the ark's coziness, to the protection against the storm, to the amazing collection of animals, to the faithfulness of God, and the hope of a fresh start when everybody comes off the ark into a new world. Grown-ups, however, can be horrified by the flood story, and we often wonder if we should be reading this story to children at all. It's not hard to see why grown-ups are horrified. After all, we could summarize the story this way. God is really upset about human violence. That's the problem. Violence is the problem. So God kills everybody. That's what the story can look like. And anti-theists, those who are actively against belief in God, they make very effective use of summaries like the one I just gave you to make their case that the loving God of the Bible is not, in fact, loving. And anti-theists often try to show that religious violence in the world is a natural consequence of stories like this, stories that model for us a violent God. And that's not all that's disturbing about the flood story. Just this past month, while I read the entire story aloud to one of my Bible classes, a student said, wait a minute. God says even babies are evil? And we all had a moment. But I had just read this. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of humanity had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. And then all human beings are wiped out in the story, of course, including the babies. So this guy had a point. But there are even more reasons to be disturbed. Even if human corruption was the problem, and let's say that you could make the case that human corruption was so bad that all human beings really did need to be wiped out. Let's say you could make that case. Why kill all the animals, too? And even if you could make the case that, yes, even the animals should be wiped out, why were the fish spared? There's no mention in the flood story of any water animals. They seem fine. And finally, if we're really going to enter into the brutality of the flood story, then let's be truly brutal. Let's get into it. And let's ask this question. Was Noah really worth saving? Because the very next thing that happens after the flood is Noah plants a vineyard, and then drinks too much wine, and then passes out drunk and naked in his tent, and then is discovered by one of his sons and covered up by the other two sons, and then, maybe my favorite phrase in the Bible, wakes up from his wine, and then curses his grandson to a life of slavery because of what happened. You're looking at me with weird faces. This is what faces look like to me Monday through Friday, by the way, now, what you're looking at me right now. You can check it, of course, but that's right. He curses his grandson. It was Ham who saw him. It was Canaan who gets cursed. He curses the son of the son who found him passed out, drunk, and naked. And just so you know, in case someone asks you to play the part, this is the only time that Noah speaks in the entire Bible to curse his grandson for something that the grandson did not do. This is the guy worth saving? This is who we want repopulating the world? So, my point is there are some serious difficulties. And I want you to imagine that you were someone who grew up maybe outside the church and you became curious about Christianity and you decided to buy a Bible. And you thought to yourself, I've heard of Noah's Ark before. All those cute animals. That sounds uplifting. I'll start there. And then you read it. And you're horrified. And you look around for the receipt so you can return the Bible. Or maybe you have grown up in the church all your life and you thought you knew the flood story because of Sunday school and picture books. And then when you actually read it for yourself, you're in for quite a shock. Because the story, if you parachute in unprepared, the story is brutal for these reasons. So the question is, what do we do about this? How do we think about this story? How do we begin to deal with the brutality? And I want to start by reviewing some of the big ideas I introduced 2 weeks ago. So here's one. The Bible, like life itself, is undomesticated. It's wild. It's raw. It's honest. It is not artificially sweetened. And we need to know that going in. Another thing, perhaps some things in the Bible are not there to be imitated or admired, but to provoke us, to spark reflection and deeper thought. Remember that the Israelites, the name literally means the people who struggle with God. These are people who are provoked into deeper thought. Another big idea, the ancient cultures of the Old and New Testaments were very different than ours. Very different. And to communicate with the people in those very different cultures, God chose to enter into their very different cultural frameworks, including their ancient and very different storytelling traditions. God entered in. God with us. And that brings us to the last big idea I want to talk about, and that's just to say that the literature of the ancient world was very different than ours, and we need to remember that when we read the Bible, we're reading ancient literature. So, with those big ideas in the background, let's immerse ourselves in the flood story. We want to do more than just get our feet wet. Let's dive in. I'm a grandfather now. I can say things like this. So we'll start with this. If the flood story in the Bible seems like a brutal story to you, that's because it is. We should open our eyes to that. Ancient flood stories in general, across cultures, were brutal. And just so you know, there are some parts of the world where there really hasn't been a tradition of ancient flood storytelling. But in general, if a part of the world has been subject to serious flooding, there's a good chance that the ancient cultures of that place had flood stories set in the legendary past as a kind of coping mechanism, maybe, as a way of trying to work out why the gods would do that to them. So in those ancient cultures that do have flood stories, almost all of them involve a lot of killing, of washing the whole world clean and starting over. Those stories are what we would call heartless and unmerciful. But the people of those times were accustomed to it. Perhaps much as we are accustomed to certain kinds of violence in certain kinds of movies. Have you noticed that there's a separate category of movie violence called sci-fi violence, which is generally considered to be easier to take and more appropriate for younger viewers than regular violence? And I wonder if the brutality of the flood stories in the ancient world might have been the sci-fi violence of the ancient world. But whatever the case, and more to the point for us, specifically in the ancient Near East, there arose a certain kind of flood story. It's even considered its own literary genre. We'll talk about it, but first we have to talk about those words, the ancient Near East. If you can picture the Fertile Crescent from the social studies classes of your youth, and if you can imagine that part of the world from the time from 3,000 years before Christ to 500 years before Christ, that's what historians call the ancient Near East. Here is a bad map to guide your reflections. There are two things you need to know about the ancient Near East. And first, you can see that there are a lot of different cultures that make up the ancient Near East, and they clearly had a lot of differences, but they also did have a lot in common, which is why historians group them together under this umbrella title, the ancient Near East. That number line across the bottom is a math teacher's way of saying what time in history it was. They didn't know it was the year negative 3,000, but we do. And the second thing that you should know about the ancient Near East is that the entire Old Testament plays out against the backdrop of the ancient Near East. All of those cultures with their common themes are what constituted normal in the time and place of every single Old Testament story of the Israelites. Abraham's birthplace, the Promised Land, Egypt, Jerusalem, the empires of Assyria and Babylon and Persia, they're all there in the ancient Near East. So I'll say this again. The overall ancient Near Eastern culture is what was normal during the time of the Israelites. And here is some serious foreshadowing. What the Israelites had to say about a loving and loyal God, about the beautiful and good world, about the dignity of every human being, male or female, was most definitely not normal in that time and place. We cannot really understand the deeply radical nature of those Old Testament proclamations until we hear them in the context of what was normal in the ancient Near East. And that is true for the Genesis flood story as well. Long before the Genesis flood story was written, there were already lots of pre-existing ancient Near Eastern flood stories, and they had common elements. Here are those common elements. The gods, plural, are upset because of human beings. They send a flood to kill just about all of them. One person gets some advance warning and builds an ark, filling it with animals and family. The flood comes, the waters rise. After a while, the captain of the ark sends out birds to see if the waters have receded. Everyone and every animal comes out of the ark to start over, and the human offers up a sacrifice to the gods. Other than the multiple gods, the flood story in Genesis has all of those elements. So in that sense, it was a normal ancient Near Eastern flood story, complete with the ancient brutality that was normal then, but upsets us now. But despite those similarities, the Genesis flood story is also dramatically and radically and world-changingly different than every other flood story in the ancient Near East. And this morning, I'm just going to describe a few of those important differences, and we'll start with the reason for the flood. But to do that, we'll have to back up a little bit. The normal ancient Near Eastern creation stories tell us that the world is made by the gods for the gods. It's something the gods do for themselves. The world is supposed to be a bubble of safety for the gods, a safe place to rest from their eternal struggle against chaos. But the world needs work done to maintain it. Chores, hard labor. The self-centered gods don't want to do that. So they create humanity as a slave class. And that is the only reason we are here, according to the normal worldview of the ancient Near East. So just picture the ancient Near Eastern gods reclining on their cosmic lazy boys, enjoying some rest, while the humans do all the work. So far, so good, but there's a problem. And it keeps getting worse. And the ancient Near Eastern problem is this: those human slaves are loud. The gods try various strategies to keep them quiet, even trying to limit their ability to have children, but the people keep increasing, and the volume keeps growing. And in their frustration, finally the gods just can't take it anymore. And they open up the floodgates of the heavens, unleashing the destructive waters of chaos. And that is the reason for the flood in the normal ancient Near Eastern flood stories. Noise pollution, pest control. Here's something else we should know. An ancient Near Eastern flood story was not making scientific statements about the past. It was making theological statements about the gods. Their flood stories were set in the mythological past, yes, but they were about the present. They were about what to think about the gods right now. And what did the normal flood stories teach? The ancient Near Eastern gods are self-centered and quick to violence when annoyed. The concern of the gods is for themselves, not for people. And again, all of this pre-exists the time of Moses by a lot. This was already in the air. All this water was in the air. And it's against that normal view, very much against it, that we have the flood story in Genesis. And again, I'm skipping a lot that I covered a year and a half ago, but this much we need to repeat. There is both a conceptual and literal central point to the Genesis flood story that we generally miss, we modern readers. Because the story is very carefully structured, especially in the use of numbers. Go look it up and read it for yourself, Genesis chapter 6 through 9. Numbers appear in the story a lot. 7 days are mentioned, and then 7 days again, and then 40 days, and then 150 days, and Noah's age to the day. And it's all to focus the ancient listener's attention on a crucial statement that's right in the middle of the story. And here is that central statement. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with Noah in the ark. And God sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. And after that central statement, the same numbers with the 7 and the 7 and the 40 and the 150 and Noah's age to the day are repeated, but in reverse order, to confirm that indeed the whole story is funneling your attention to the literally central point. And if you do want more details about that, you can find this sermon from a year and a half ago on the church's YouTube channel, where you can even see some spiffy diagrams, every bit as good as that map I showed you. I want you to think about that central point that God remembers, in contrast to the normal ancient Near Eastern flood story. God remembers. God is focused on the people and the animals. God is not self-absorbed. But perhaps even more amazing is the character development that is present in the Genesis flood story. And what I'm about to say is something that we modern people find quite unsettling. We who live after the ancient Greek philosophers and their obsession with unchanging eternal truth. What I'm about to say is unsettling because the character development in the story is not found in human beings. I'll prove that. Here's how the humans start in the flood story. The Lord saw how every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. There's the title of your memoir. Only evil all the time. I won't even take royalties. You can just use it. And here's how the humans end in that story. The Lord said, "Never again will I curse the ground because of human beings, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood." There is no character development to be found there. From evil to evil. It's another good title. But there is character development in God, which is astonishing to us. Because God's response to the evil human heart at the beginning of the story isn't anger, as is commonly thought, but sadness, grief, followed by "I will wipe out." But God's response to the same evil human heart at the end of the story is, "Never again will I wipe out." Something has changed. Something has changed in God's heart. And this is shocking to those of us who have allowed the ancient Greek philosophers to define for us what God must be like. More on that in a bit. Then, as the flood story proceeds in the Bible, this God whom we just were told in the literally central point of the story is the God who remembers. This God, after saying "never again," proceeds to make a covenant that your Bibles probably headline as God's covenant with Noah, but which in fact, if the publishers have bothered to read the text, is a covenant God makes with Noah and with all humans and with all animals and with all of creation. And we've already heard part of that covenant this morning. God says, as long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, will never cease. And then God says, the rainbow will be the sign of the covenant. And this God who remembers, remember that's the central point, God remembers. This God says, whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Which brings us to another astonishing point. The Genesis flood story, when you look at it, is actually an anti-flood story. Listen to how it ends. It's a cultural Trojan horse. God enters into the typical, normal, and brutal ancient Near Eastern flood story and then dismantles it from the inside. We are told at the end that the God who is other-focused, the God who remembers, is also the God who, even though experiencing pain and grief because of our violence, essentially withdraws the lawsuit against humanity. God's character development in the story shows us that God is willing to endure pain in order to preserve the well-being of the world. God is willing to endure pain to preserve the well-being of the world. Walter Brueggemann, an amazing biblical scholar often mentioned here, gave a sermon on the flood story about 13 years ago in Tulsa, Oklahoma, of all places. The people who heard this sermon must have been a bit astonished. I'm going to read some of it to you. This is not an entire sermon I'm reading to you, just so you know. He started with this. What would you do if you were God and you saw the world you had made go crazy with violence and corruption? Well, if you were the God of the philosophers, all-knowing, almighty, all-present, you might not respond at all. But if you were the God of the Bible, the God who loves the world, what you would do is engage that world that has gone crazy. You would engage at some deep emotional level that matched your love and your concern. And I'm not going to do this, but he goes off on a long tangent about how parents know exactly what this feels like. You're so engaged with your children that sometimes your response is quite emotional. And this is how the Bible imagines God in the flood story, he says. In an emotional frenzy over betrayed love, God decided to drown his sorrows. All the faucets of heaven and earth were opened to full blast. And then Brueggemann says this, please understand, this story is not about the water. This story is about God's emotional attachment. This is a God who cares in frenzied ways about the earth. And then in a jarring moment of recognition, we are told God remembered. So what would you do if you were this God? Brueggemann preached. Well, what this God did was make a second effort. God remembers twice, says Brueggemann. Once with Noah to stop the waters, and then again with the rainbow to sustain the world. This is not about the water. It's about God. It's about the God who emotes, but who circles back with a second effort to flood us with fidelity, to flood us with faithfulness, with loyalty and love. Classic Brueggemann, unique, provocative. But he too says that the Genesis flood story, which was unprecedented in the ancient Near East, shows us the heart of God, and what is in that heart is sacrificial love. I wonder if that sounds familiar. Sacrificial love in the heart of God here in a community where Christ's living presence is in our center. Here is the answer to that question. Yes, Paul, it does sound familiar. Against our first impressions of brutality, the flood story describes astonishingly, the same loving heart of God that we find described in the Gospels when they show us the heart of Jesus. So, is the flood story of Genesis brutal? Yes. If we parachute into it from our modern worldview, are we offended and disturbed? Of course. But is it modern literature? Absolutely not. But if we enter into its indigenous culture, which is the ancient Near East, we find that there is in this Genesis story a powerful and beautiful and very emotional proclamation about the heart of God. And once again, here's what we find there. Love, but not just sort of Valentine's Day love. Sacrificial love, deep, powerful love for the whole world, and therefore for every single one of us. Amen.